So in order to think about unemployment in the long run, we want to extend our labor market model and think not just about the short-term ups and downs of the business cycle, but also about what happens in the long run when the labor market is more or less at equilibrium. And often what we mean in terms of the long run is that firms can enter or exit. And so what we'll see is that firms will enter when profit rates are high and they will exit when profit rates are low. And the employment rate is going to depend on the wage setting curve and the price setting curve, just as it did in the short term, which will mean that work incentives are going to be important. How do the institutions balance the incentive to work with the incentive to help protect people who are unemployed and who might be dispersed through technological change? And investment incentives for the firms. And so, do they enter or exit? How many firms are there? And so when we think about that long run equilibrium, those wages, employment levels are going to depend a lot on the number of firms. So how do we think about how many firms there are in an industry? Well, a lot of that has to do with how big the markup is, right? And so if we put the markup, which we use this Greek letter mu for the markup, and remember, the higher the markup is, the higher the profits are for firms. And so if we're up here and the markup is really high at point B, then firms are going to enter and we're going to move down to a lower markup and more firms. And why does the markup go down when firms enter? It's because of increased competition, right? So the higher is the level of competition, firms will find that they have to lower their markup in order to stay in business. On the other hand, if there's a really low markup, like here at point C, then firms will exit, right? Because they will find that it's not profitable to stay in business. We'll move up the profit maximizing markup line back to point A, and that will be our long run equilibrium, right? So what's important to remember is that the level of competition is going to be extremely important. And as there's more competition, if more firms enter and we get to a new equilibrium markup that is lower, so if we move from point A down to point C, then we'll have a lower markup, but we'll have more firms. And with more firms, we'll have more employment. So we can think of the translation between the real wage and employment as depending on productivity, right? This Greek letter lambda we use for productivity, and all that means is how much workers are producing, per hour, per day, per year, in equilibrium profits, which we're calling here mu star. And so the long run price setting curve, right, which remember was just that horizontal line, is just the wage is equal to however much workers produce, lambda, times 1 minus the markup. And so if you think about, all right, well, workers produce $100 an hour, so that's lambda, and the markup is 30%, then firms get $30 an hour, 30% times 100, and workers get $70 per hour. So the price setting curve is going to depend on a lot of things, right? It could depend on the long run tax rates. That's the debate now going on in Congress is how much the corporations should pay in taxes, and Congress is trying to lower that. It's going to depend on the level of competition, another factor that is important currently. There are a lot of economists that feel that competition has decreased in the United States, which has increased the markup and increased profits. It's going to depend on the risk of expropriation. So, how likely is it that the government will come in and take profits? That's less important in a country like the United States, but it can be very important in developing countries. It's going to depend on the quality of the human capital, so how educated, how skilled workers are, infrastructure, are there roads, ports, airlines, electricity, the opportunity cost of capital, so can you do something else with your capital that's more profitable, and your costs, right? So your costs for your inputs. So we could have a high mu where the price setting curve shifts down. So if our output per worker is fixed up here at lambda, if the markup is really high, we'll end up here at a lower price setting curve. If the markup is really low, we'll end up here at a higher price setting curve. So just remember that the difference between output per worker and the price setting curve is mu. So the higher mu shifts down the price setting curve, right? Firms get more and workers get less. So what happens with technological improvement? Well, technology can actually improve both real wages and employment in the long run, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some costs in the short run. And since we all live in the short run, we don't ever get to say, oh, finally, I'm living in the long run. That can be important, right? It can be important both economically and politically if people are experiencing a lot of job destruction and job loss. And so the adjustment gap is that lag between some, outside change in the labor market, uh, for instance, new technological improvement and the movement to the new equilibrium. And so we're going to look at both sort of where we go in the long run, but also what happens in the short run. And what we call the diffusion gap is the time it takes for the whole economy to adopt the innovation. So if we think about, the adoption of electricity in the early part of the 20th century, the adoption of computer technology in the mid to late part of, the later part of the 20th century, and now really the adoption of sort of information technology and the internet now, that's the diffusion gap. So here we can think, here we have our, real wage, our wage setting curve. Remember, the wage setting curve comes from firms having to pay more to workers when the unemployment rate is low. So remember, unemployment is decreasing as we move to the right and increasing as we move to the left. Output per worker, that's our lambda. And so the markup here is the difference between the output per worker and the real wage. And so here at A, that's our equilibrium. So what happens then when we introduce a new technology? Well, new technology means that output per worker goes up, right? That's almost the definition of a new technology, is that workers are now able to produce more per hour. And so if the markup stays the same, right? So that the difference between the new output per worker and the new price setting curve is the same, then we're going to move up the wage setting curve, right? And we will end up with a higher real wage, as we have seen, with higher living standards, and in fact, a lower unemployment rate. Now, keep in mind that this assumes that the labor supply stays the same. And in the long run, of course, what we've seen is that the labor supply has grown as population has grown, but we are entering a world in which some countries, especially countries that don't have a lot of immigration, have started to experience either a stable population or even a decreasing population. So look at a country like Japan, they've actually started to see their population decrease. So that sounds great, right? New technology means higher wages and lower unemployment. What's the problem? Where are the robots taking our jobs? Well, the problem is that we don't always get to that new equilibrium right away, right? And so it could be that we introduce a new technology which destroys all of the jobs in the old technology, and those people become unemployed. And so unemployment increases as we move from A to D. Now, as we move from D to E, higher profits encourage new firms to enter, right? So we're at workers are producing more, but we don't actually have to pay them that much because unemployment is high. Firms flood into the market, and we move up to point E, and that leads us to lower unemployment and higher real wages, right? So the firms have to compete for workers. That means they have to pay higher wages, and that leads us to point B. And so the real question is, do we move quickly from A to B, or does it take a long time, right? If it takes a long time to go from A to D to E to B, then we have a lot of unemployed workers, we have a lot of unhappy people, and it looks like this new technological progress is really destroying more jobs than it's creating, even though in the long run it may create more jobs than it destroys. So what else could happen in that long run? Well, we could actually have a shift up in the wage curve, right? And so if we have a shift up in the wage curve, then we could end up with higher wages but the same unemployment rate, right? So instead of going from A to B on the old wage curve and having lower unemployment, we could go from A to C, where we still get that higher wage, but we still have the same original unemployment rate. And why would that happen? Well, it could be that there was fair shares bargaining by unions. So unions said, hey, we have this new technology, you have to pay us more, and that shifts up the wage curve. It could be that politicians say, ooh, this is really bad. We ended up with higher unemployment. We want to protect those people who might be affected. And so we have employment protection laws. It could be that there's a greater disutility of effort, right? So when you think about the switch from agriculture to factory work, people really hated factory work. And so there was a huge disutility of effort. There was a huge turnover in workers who just didn't like working in factories. And so that could also be one reason for it. Or there could be an improvement in the reservation wage, right? So either governments offer better unemployment benefits, or there's a better outside option. Maybe people have the outside option to work at home, be self-employed. So that could shift up the wage curve as well. So if we think about the long run versus the short run, these are very important issues because, as I said, we're always living in the short run. And so if we're at a point like D where the unemployment rate is high because of this new technology, then it might look like that new technology is a bad idea, right? And so in that case, the unemployment rate goes up, wage shares go down, and inequality goes up. But in the long run, if we can help the economy sort of adjust to that new equilibrium, then we will actually end up with higher real wages, higher employment, lower unemployment, and inequality that is probably a little bit lower.